The first instinct of the villagers, after the initial paralysis, was to do anything that might make the scene less real. Mrs. Pelling fluttered forward with the helpless authority of a woman who had organized too many committees to accept that events could occur outside her control. She reached for Edmund Bellamy's shoulder as if he might be persuaded to sit up properly, like an unruly guest at an awkward dinner. Inspector Graves caught her wrist gently but firmly. "Best not to touch him, ma'am." Mrs. Pelling blinked, as though the notion of best not had never before been applied to her. "But he can't lie there," she whispered. "Not in the drawing room, not with the tea set still out on the lawn." "He can," the inspector said, not unkindly. "And he will until the doctor comes." At those words, Reverend Hale drew in a sharp breath, his lips moving soundlessly, prayer perhaps, or merely habit. Margaret Dyer's face tightened, and she pressed a hand against her mouth as though to hold something back. Clara Fenwick did not look at Mrs. Pelling at all. Her gaze had fixed itself on the mirror above the fireplace with the rigidity of a person trying to remember whether she had locked a door. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting gathered in her lap like a small domestic shield. She watched Inspector Graves's eyes travel around the room with practiced attention. He was the sort of man who believed in order and steps followed correctly, in facts that sat neatly beside one another like tools in a tray. It was a comforting approach, but Miss Marple had known disorder far too long to trust comfort. The inspector crouched carefully and examined Bellamy without touching him. "Any of you see him come in?" he asked without looking up. There was a little stirring, as if the question itself had shaken them into motion. "I saw him go inside perhaps 10 minutes ago," Mrs. Pelling said quickly. "He said something about fetching the ledger for the charity accounts. He was being so generous. He promised he'd match every pound raised, didn't you, Edmund?" "Oh." She caught herself and made a small choking sound. "I only noticed he'd disappeared," Margaret Dyer said, her voice strained and tight. "He wasn't at the cake table when I went back for another slice." Reverend Hale cleared his throat. "I was speaking with Mrs. Pelling. He was in the garden. I remember because he offered me a cup of tea. He laughed. He made a joke about the vicar and the vicar's wives always being the first to judge a sponge. And you, miss?" Inspector Graves looked up at Clara Fenwick. Clara's mouth opened. For a moment, nothing came out at all. Then she said, "Very carefully, Mr. Bellamy told me to fetch the papers from the drawing room. I went down the corridor." Her eyes flicked again to the mirror. A quick, involuntary movement, and then she forced them back to the inspector's face. "I found him there. Did you touch anything?" "No. I swear I didn't." I screamed, and then I ran back outside. I told Mrs. Pelling. Inspector Graves's gaze went to the smear of blood on the gilt frame. It had a particular look, dragged rather than splashed, as though a hand had caught the edge while steadying itself or pushing away. He did not comment on it, but his mouth tightened slightly, like a man making a note without writing it down. Miss Marple's eyes moved instead to the floorboards. The blood had pooled and then reached outward in slow, eager fingers. Near it, close to the base of the fireplace, the boards gleamed with a polish that made every mark visible. There were faint scuffs, nothing dramatic, nothing that shouted struggle, merely the sort of small displacements that happened when someone stepped back too quickly. It was quite possible, Miss Marple thought, to commit a great deal of violence without any theatrical mess at all. Dr. Haydock arrived with brisk efficiency, as though the village had inconvenienced him personally by producing a corpse. Between luncheon and supper, he examined Edmund Bellamy in silence, his face unreadable. When he stood, he removed his spectacles and wiped them once with a corner of his handkerchief. "He's dead," he said, as though confirming the weather. "Not long gone. How?" Mrs. Pelling managed her voice high. Dr. Haydock looked at Inspector Graves. "Hard to say without a proper examination. There's blood, but blood can be misleading. Could be a head injury, could be something else. He struck something, see the angle of his neck." He paused, and his eyes briefly followed Clara's toward the mirror. But this wasn't a simple fainting spell. Inspector Graves nodded, We'll have him moved shortly. No one leaves Rosewell House, not yet." There was a collective intake of breath at that. The garden tea, the bunting, the polite laughter, all of it felt absurd now, like decorations left up after a storm. Through the open doors, the lawn looked impossibly bright. "Inspector," Reverend Hale began, attempting a soothing tone that wavered, "surely these are our friends, our neighbors. Neighbors can kill each other," Inspector Graves replied. And then, seeing the vicar's expression, he softened it just a fraction. "I'm sorry, but I have to do this properly." The question of properly had a curious effect. Several villagers straightened, as though the mention of procedure had reminded them of their own importance. Miss Marple saw the small adjustments. A woman smoothing her skirt, a man lifting his chin, Margaret Dyer moving half a step away from Clara Fenwick as if distance might become proof. Inspector Graves began assigning people to the smaller sitting room, away from the drawing room and its mirror. Clara was asked to sit, and did so with the fragile obedience of someone holding herself together by thread. Mrs. Pelling hovered near the doorway, whispering instructions to no one at all, about tea and chairs and finding shawls, as though hospitality might repair death. Reverend Hale placed a hand on Margaret Dyer's shoulder, and she flinched, as if she hadn't expected comfort to feel like touch. Miss Marple remained where she was until the inspector, passing, paused and looked at her with faint surprise. "And you, Miss Marple," she supplied gently, "Jane Marple. I live at the edge of the village, you know, near the old lane. I was invited for the tea." Inspector Graves's eyes lingered on her knitting. The little click of needles sounded indecently normal in the heavy air. "Did you see anything unusual?" "Oh, everything is unusual," Miss Marple said mildly, and then, as his expression tightened, she added, "I'm afraid I didn't see Mr. Bellamy come inside. I was watching the cake. One does like to know who cuts the first slice. It's very revealing. People think it's all manners, but it isn't. It tells you who believes they are entitled." The inspector stared for a moment, uncertain whether he was being mocked. Then he said, "All right," and moved on. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting again, but she did not see the stitches. In the drawing room, two constables moved carefully, murmuring to each other as they measured and noted. The mirror above the fireplace reflected them faithfully, but it was the smear of blood at its edge that held her attention. It was not merely that blood had touched the frame, but that it had been drawn along the gilt in a direction that suggested purpose, or at least an urgent movement. People always reached for something in fear. A chair back, a doorknob, another person, or a mirror. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Clara Fenwick, sitting very straight in the smaller room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The young woman's fingers were pale from pressure, her nails bitten short. She looked, Miss Marple observed, like someone trying desperately not to rub at a particular spot, as though her skin remembered a sensation her mind did not wish to acknowledge. Outside, beyond the glass doors, the guests still stood scattered on the lawn, held in place by the invisible cord of authority. Their voices rose and fell in nervous whispers. From where she sat, Miss Marple caught fragments: money, London, scandal, secretary, return, inheritance. Each word landed like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. In the hallway, a door clicked softly. It was a small sound, almost nothing at all, easily lost beneath the murmur of frightened people and the scrape of a chair. But Miss Marple's head lifted at once. Her needles paused, hovering over the wall. Something in Rosewell House, it seemed, was not yet finished moving. The sound proved to be nothing so dramatic as a fleeing culprit, though it unsettled the house all the same. A young constable emerged from the corridor, apologetic, explaining that a window at the back had been open and the breeze had caught a door. Inspector Graves accepted this with a nod, but the explanation did little to ease the collective unease. Once the idea of movement had entered the mind, it lingered stubbornly. Rosewell House seemed suddenly full of corners. The inspector began the slow, methodical work of separating people from one another. Chairs were drawn apart. Polite proximity gave way to measured distance. Each villager, now conscious of being observed, adopted a version of themselves they hoped would appear most respectable under scrutiny. Miss Marple watched these small transformations with quiet interest. In her experience, people rarely lied well when they were trying to be good. Clara Fenwick was questioned first. Inspector Graves took a chair opposite her, notebook resting on his knee, his tone careful but firm. She answered plainly enough at the start how long she had worked for Mr. Bellamy, what her duties were, when she had last seen him alive. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her. They twisted together, then stilled, then twisted again, as if rehearsing a motion they were forbidden to complete. "You were alone in the house when you found him?" the inspector asked. "Yes." A pause. "At least I believed I was." "Believed?" Clara frowned faintly, as though surprised by her own choice of words. "The house is very quiet," she said. "It always has been. You can move about without hearing anyone else. Mr. Bellamy liked it that way." "Did he?" Inspector Graves made a note. "And did he often come back inside during gatherings?" "Sometimes," Clara said. "He disliked crowds. He said they made it too easy to miss things." Miss Marple's eyes lifted briefly. That, she thought, sounded very much like Edmund Bellamy. Inspector Graves moved on to Mrs. Pelling, whose distress took the form of relentless explanation. She spoke of the planning of the tea, of Bellamy's generosity, of how pleased he had seemed that morning. She assured the inspector repeatedly that no one insane Mildred's had reason to wish him harm, save perhaps the sort of harmless jealousy that accompanied success, except, the inspector said quietly, that success has a way of creating more than harmless feelings. Mrs. Pelling faltered. "Well," she admitted, lowering her voice, "there was the business in London. People talk." "What business?" "Oh, nothing proven," she said quickly. "Just rumors. Disagreements." Mr. Bellamy was very discreet. Discretion, Miss Marple reflected, was often a word people used when they meant concealment. Margaret Dyer proved more difficult. She sat rigidly, her handbag clutched against her side, as though it might drift away if released. When Inspector Graves asked about her relationship with Edmund Bellamy, a flicker passed over her face, something like resentment, quickly smothered. "We grew up together," she said. "That's all. He left. I stayed. People change." "Did you quarrel?" "Everyone quarrels," Margaret replied sharply, then checked herself. "But nothing that would." She gestured helplessly toward the other room. "And yet," the inspector said, "you seemed shaken when you saw him." Margaret's fingers tightened around the clasp. "I was surprised," she said. "That's all." Miss Marple noticed that she did not say shocked. Reverend Hale was next, offering his cooperation with the earnest gravity of a man accustomed to being trusted. He spoke of Bellamy's contributions to the parish, of their occasional disagreement over charitable priorities, of nothing that might suggest violence. Still, there was a faint tension beneath his words, a carefulness that suggested he was choosing each phrase rather than allowing them to arise naturally. As the afternoon wore on, the light shifted within Rosewell House. Shadows crept along the walls, and the mirror in the drawing-room grew darker, its reflection less distinct. The body had been removed at last, carried out with solemn care, but the room itself seemed marked by absence. Miss Marple felt it keenly. Death, she had long observed, left a draught behind it. Inspector Graves returned to the drawing-room alone and stood before the mirror for a long moment. The smear of blood had been cleaned away, leaving the gilt frame gleaming once more. And yet, to Miss Marple's eye, it was not quite the same. Something lingered in the mind even when the evidence was gone. She rose quietly and moved closer, her steps small and unobtrusive. "An impressive piece," the inspector said without turning. "Old, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Very old things tend to remember." He glanced at her then, uncertain whether she was speaking figuratively. "You knew Mr. Bellamy?" "Not well," she said, "but I've known his sort." "And what sort is that?" she considered. "A man who believes he has arranged his life neatly, only to discover that other people have been arranging this around him." Inspector Graves studied her for a moment, then looked back at the mirror. "You notice things, Miss Marple?" "Oh, one has time," she said pleasantly. He gestured toward the fireplace. The doctor thinks he may have been struck from behind. No sign of a weapon yet. It could have been something close at hand. Miss Marple's gaze followed the line of the mantel. A clock, a small bronze figurine. A paperweight, oddly heavy for its size. All perfectly ordinary, all perfectly capable. "And the blood on the mirror?" she asked. "Instinct," the inspector said. A man falling reaches out. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But people don't always reach for what is nearest. They reach for what they are used to." Inspector Graves frowned slightly, as if the idea unsettled him. Before he could respond, a constable appeared in the doorway. "Sir," he said, "we found something in Mr. Bellamy's study." They followed him down the corridor to a small, orderly room lined with shelves. On the desk lay a thin stack of papers and an envelope, its seal broken. Inspector Graves lifted the top page and read quickly. "It's a letter," he said, "from a solicitor. Dated last week. What does it say?" Mrs. Pelling asked from behind them, unable to restrain herself. "It concerns a change to Mr. Bellamy's will," the inspector replied. "A significant one." The room seemed to contract. Clara Fenwick's breath caught audibly. Margaret Dyer swayed, just slightly, and steadied herself against the doorframe. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She was watching Clara's hands. They had begun, quite unconsciously, to rub at one another, check, wipe, as though trying to remove a mark no one else could see. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple felt the shape of the village shift. Secrets, long held, had been nudged from their resting places. Whatever had happened in the drawing room had not begun there. It had only ended there. The discovery of the letter altered the atmosphere of Rosewell House more decisively than the removal of the body ever had. Death might shock, but money rearranged loyalties with remarkable speed. Inspector Graves did not read the contents aloud. He merely folded the pages and slipped them back into the envelope. Yet the damage was done. Every face in the room reflected a different calculation. "We'll discuss this individually," he said. "For now, I want everyone to remain where they are." The study felt suddenly too small, its neat shelves and orderly desk now suggestive rather than reassuring. Clara Fenwick hovered near the doorway, her eyes fixed on the envelope as if it might begin speaking on its own. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded, observing the way Clara's shoulders had drawn up, as though bracing for a blow that had not yet landed. Inspector Graves began again, this time with more precision. Questions returned, but sharpened now by motive. How long had Mr. Bellamy intended to change his will? Had he discussed it with anyone? Who stood to gain? "I handled much of his correspondence," Clara said quietly, "but he didn't confide in me about personal matters." "Did he ever mention dissatisfaction?" the inspector asked. "Yes," Clara admitted, then hesitated, "not with his work. With people. He said he'd been too trusting once, and he wouldn't make that mistake again." Margaret Dyer's head lifted sharply. That could mean anything. It could, Inspector Graves agreed. "Which is why I'm asking." Margaret's composure cracked at last, just enough to show the strain beneath. "Edmund liked to make pronouncements," she said. "He enjoyed watching people guess what he meant. It doesn't mean he intended harm." "Intentions change," the inspector replied. As he turned to question Reverend Hale again, Miss Marple allowed herself a small inward sigh. So much attention was being paid to words written and spoken, to documents and dates, and so little to the manner in which those words had been received. People reacted to information long before they acted upon it. She had seen it often enough at village fetes and parish meetings, a look exchanged across a table. A silence held for half a second too long. Those were the true signals. Inspector Graves dismissed them one by one to the sitting room, keeping Clara back. When the door closed, the room seemed to exhale. Clara sat, her back very straight, her hands folded with almost painful neatness. "You found the letter?" she asked. "Yes," the inspector said. "In the study. Where you said Mr. Bellamy sent you." "I didn't open it," Clara said quickly. "I swear I didn't. He told me not to." "Did you know what was in it?" "No." Inspector Graves studied her for a moment. "Miss Fenwick, you've worked for Mr. Bellamy for 3 years. You lived here. You knew his habits. That makes you very useful to us and potentially very vulnerable." Her lips parted, then closed again. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He wasn't an easy man." "No," the inspector said, "he rarely is." She pressed her hands together more tightly, then released them, then pressed them again, the motion unconscious and repetitive. Miss Marple, watching from her chair by the window, noted the faint redness creeping along Clara's knuckles. "What frightened you most about finding him?" the inspector asked suddenly. Clara blinked. What?" "The room," he clarified. "The moment you opened the door. What struck you first?" For a moment Clara seemed unable to answer. Her eyes drifted without permission toward the place where the mirror had been. Though the room was empty now, the space still claimed attention. "The mirror," she said at last. I thought he was looking at himself. Then I saw the blood." Inspector Graves leaned back slightly. "Why would that thought occur to you?" Clara swallowed. "Because he did that sometimes." He stood there and looked, as if checking something. Miss Marple's head tilted a fraction. Checking, she thought, was an interesting word. The inspector nodded, filed the comment away, and dismissed Clara at last. She rose unsteadily and left the room, pausing only when she reached the hallway, where she pressed her palms briefly against her skirt, as though to wipe away sensation. Left alone, Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple. "You've been very quiet," he said. "It's such a noisy business," she replied mildly. He gave a short, humorless smile. "You've seen these situations before." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though never precisely this one. People do so like to believe their circumstances are unique." "What do you believe?" he asked. She looked out the window, where the lawn lay abandoned, teacups still scattered on tables like forgotten props. "I believe," she said slowly, "that someone was very startled in that room, and that someone else was very prepared." The inspector frowned. "Prepared how?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She rose instead and walked, with careful steps, back into the drawing room. The mirror gleamed harmlessly now, its surface spotless. She stood before it, studying her own reflection, a small, elderly woman, eyes sharp beneath soft lids. "People reveal themselves when they think they are unseen," she said at last. "Mirrors make liars uncomfortable." Inspector Graves followed her gaze. "You think the mirror matters?" "Oh, very much," Miss Marple replied. "Not because of what it shows, but because of when it was noticed." She turned back to him. "Miss Fenwick looked at the mirror before she looked at the body. That tells us something about her habits." "And Mr. Bellamy's?" The inspector was silent, considering this. Then a constable appeared at the door once more. "Sir," he said, "we've spoken to the solicitor. The will was to be changed tomorrow morning." That, Miss Marple thought, explained a great many things. Inspector Graves straightened. "All right," he said. "No one leaves the village tonight." As the constable departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting. The needles clicked softly again, a sound of domestic normality pressed into the service of careful thought. A man had died between a garden party and a letter being acted upon. Somewhere in Rosewell House, a decision had been made faster than regret could catch it. And in St. Mildred's, the village was beginning to understand that it would not escape itself quite so easily as it had hoped. Night settled over St. Mildred's with intimacy that felt almost conspiratorial. Lamps were lit behind curtained windows, and the village lanes, usually content to be empty after supper, now seemed alert, as though listening. Rosewell House remained the brightest point, its windows glowing steadily while Inspector Graves and his constables worked on. No one was permitted to leave, but people were allowed to retire to their rooms or return to nearby cottages under watchful escort. The effect was unsettling. The village, so fond of order, had been rearranged into something provisional. Miss Marple returned home early, at the inspector's suggestion, and later that evening he came to call. He found her seated by the fire, knitting in a pool of lamplight, a pot of tea already waiting. She greeted him with the same gentle civility she extended to everyone, which had the peculiar effect of making him feel, for a moment, as though he were not entirely in control of the interview. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. I find evenings very useful. One thinks better when there are fewer interruptions. He accepted the tea, glanced around the neat sitting room, and then came directly to the point. I'd like to hear your impressions, not officially, of course, she said. Officially one must be very careful. He waited. Miss Marple set down her needles. There are two kinds of people who commit sudden acts, she began. Those who are overwhelmed, and those who have been waiting. They behave quite differently afterward. And which do you think we have? He asked. She smiled faintly, perhaps both. Which complicates matters. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Let's talk about Miss Fenwick. Ah, Miss Marple said. Yes, she had opportunity, he continued. She knew Bellamy's habits. She was alone in the house, and she stands to gain. Does she? Miss Marple asked gently. The inspector frowned. The will named her as a beneficiary. Not the primary one, but enough to matter. Miss Marple considered this. It's very tempting money, she said, but it's rarely enough by itself. People endure all sorts of discomfort for security. What they don't endure well is fear. You think she was afraid of him. I think she was afraid of something, Miss Marple corrected, which is not quite the same thing. Inspector Graves made a note, then looked up. Margaret Dyer, then. Childhood history. Lingering resentment. She seemed brittle. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Like a teacup that's been chipped once already. But brittle things break openly. They make noise. And Reverend Hale? Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. A good man, she said after a pause, which does not exclude the possibility of wrongdoing. But his anxieties are of a different sort. Moral anxieties, I should think. The inspector sighed. You're very good at this, Miss Marple. It's not a skill, she replied, it's a habit. When he left, the house seemed quieter for his absence. Miss Marple sat for some time afterward, staring into the fire, her knitting untouched. In the glow, she replayed the afternoon with careful attention, not to what had been said, but to what had been avoided. The mirror, the letter, the timing each formed part of a pattern she was beginning to recognize. The next morning brought a brittle sort of clarity. News had spread, of course, it always did. By breakfast, the village had produced at least 4 versions of events, each more confident than the last. Miss Marple listened to them over toast at the small cafe near the green, nodding politely, offering nothing. She had learned long ago that people spoke more freely when they believed they were educating someone. Poor Mr. Bellamy, one woman said, stirring her tea. They say he was about to cut someone out of his will entirely. Serves him right, another replied. You don't come back after 20 years and expect everything to be as it was. Miss Marple smiled into her cup. Later that morning, Inspector Graves summoned them all back to Rosewell House. The study had been rearranged slightly, chairs placed in a loose semicircle. The air felt charged, expectant. Clara Fenwick sat very straight, her face pale but composed. Margaret Dyer had dressed carefully, as though armor might be stitched from good fabric. Reverend Hale clasped his hands together, his eyes downcast. I've spoken with the solicitor, Inspector Graves said. Mr. Bellamy intended to alter his will significantly. The changes would have affected several of you. There was a stir at that. Margaret's breath caught. Clara's fingers twitched. The question, the inspector continued, is who knew about it and when. I didn't, Margaret said quickly. I had no idea. Reverend Hale shook his head. Nor I. Clara hesitated. I knew he was unhappy, she said, but he didn't tell me specifics. Inspector Graves turned toward Miss Marple. And you? She met his gaze calmly. I knew he was frightened, she said. Her silence fell. Frightened of what? Margaret demanded. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Of being seen, she replied. Truly seen. The inspector frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple rose and walked once more to the mirror. Sunlight streamed in now, filling the room with honest brightness. She stood where Bellamy had stood. Mr. Bellamy spent a great deal of time looking at himself, she said. Not out of vanity, but out of uncertainty. He was checking whether the man he believed himself to be was the one others saw. And was he? Inspector Graves asked quietly. No, Miss Marple said. He was someone else entirely. The room seemed to lean toward her. Someone knew that, she continued. Someone had known it for a very long time, long enough to be afraid of what a new will might reveal. Clara's hands moved again, rub, check, wipe her knuckles, reddening under the strain. Miss Marple turned to her at last. You weren't afraid of Mr. Bellamy, she said softly. You were afraid of the mirror. Clara looked up, eyes wide. And mirrors, Miss Marple added, are very dangerous things when they start reflecting the past. No one spoke. Outside, the village waited, unaware that its neat surface was already beginning to crack. Clara Fenwick did not faint, though several people later said they had expected her to. Instead, she sat very still, as though the words had settled on her shoulders with physical weight. Her hands had stopped moving at last. The silence that followed Miss Marple's remark was not empty. It was crowded with things no one wished to say first. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Miss Fenwick, he said, carefully neutral, perhaps you'd like to explain what Miss Marple means. Clara's gaze shifted not to the inspector, nor to Margaret Dyer or the vicar, but back to the mirror. Sunlight struck its surface at an angle now, throwing a pale reflection across the rug. When she spoke, her voice was steadier than anyone expected. Mr. Bellamy used to say that mirrors were honest, she said, that they told the truth when people wouldn't. And did you agree with him? The inspector asked. No, Clara replied. I thought they were cruel. Margaret Dyer gave a sharp, incredulous laugh. That's absurd. We're talking about a man's death. Yes, Clara said, turning to her at last. We are. Inspector Graves raised a hand, forestalling the rising tension. Miss Fenwick, did Mr. Bellamy confide in you? Clara hesitated. Not in the way you mean. But I listened. That was my job. And what did you hear? She drew in a breath. Regret. Anger. Fear. She paused. And plans. The word plans landed heavily. He was afraid someone would come forward. Clara continued. Someone from before. He said he had made arrangements, that he would put things right before it was too late. Put what right? Margaret demanded. Clara's eyes flicked toward her again, then away. I don't know, she said. Not exactly. He never named it. Miss Marple watched Margaret closely. The woman's lips had pressed into a thin line, her posture rigid with restraint. It was the sort of restraint born not of innocence, but of long practice. Inspector Graves paced slowly. You said Mr. Bellamy was frightened of being seen, he said to Miss Marple. Seen how? As he truly was, Miss Marple replied, not as the respectable benefactor, but as the man he had been when choices were made quietly and consequences delayed. Margaret's hand tightened around her handbag again. This is nonsense, she said. Vague insinuation. Vagueness, Miss Marple said gently, is very often a shield. The inspector turned back to Clara. When you went into the drawing room, what exactly did you see? Clara closed her eyes briefly. His back, she said. He was standing in front of the mirror. He must have heard me because he turned quickly. He looked startled. And then there was an argument, Clara said. At least he spoke sharply. I don't remember what he said. Something about not being interrupted. I apologized. I turned to leave. Her voice wavered. And then I heard something behind me. A sound, like a heavy object striking wood. She opened her eyes. When I turned back, he was already falling. Inspector Graves stopped pacing. You didn't see anyone else? No. No struggle. No. Margaret let out a breath. So he fell, she said. That's what we all thought at first. Miss Marple shook her head. No, she said. That's what we wanted to think. The inspector nodded slowly. The doctor believes he was struck. Not hard enough to kill outright, but enough to disorient him. The fall finished it. Margaret's color drained slightly. Are you suggesting I'm suggesting? Inspector Graves said evenly, that someone was close enough to strike him. And then what? Margaret snapped. Vanished? Miss Marple spoke before the inspector could answer. No, she said. They stayed. The room stilled again. They stayed, Miss Marple repeated, because leaving would have been noticed, because the garden was full, because the house was not empty. She turned her gaze to the vicar. then back to Margaret, then finally to Clara. And because the mirror had already seen them. Clara's breath came shallow now. He saw me, she said. That's what frightened him. Not the will. Me. Why? Inspector Graves asked. Because I reminded him, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, of something he thought he'd buried. Margaret stood abruptly. This is outrageous, she said. You're accusing her now? No, Miss Marple said. I'm listening to her. Margaret's eyes flashed. You always liked to listen, didn't you? She said sharply, then stopped, as though startled by herself. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Like to listen to whom, my dear? Margaret flushed. To everyone. To gossip. To things that aren't your business. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied, it is always my business to notice when someone speaks out of turn. Inspector Graves's attention fixed on Margaret. What did you mean by that? Margaret pressed her lips together. Nothing. But the moment had passed. Something had slipped through. Miss Marple rose again, moving slowly, deliberately. Mr. Bellamy was not afraid of a secretary, she said. He was afraid of recognition, of being looked at by someone who knew him before he learned how to arrange his face. She turned to Margaret. You knew him as a boy, as a young man, before he left. Margaret's voice was thin. We all knew him then. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But not all of us knew what he did. The inspector inhaled sharply. Miss Dyer, Margaret shook her head, once, violently. You're wrong, she said. All of you. Edmund was cruel, sometimes selfish, but not. Her voice broke, not that. Clara looked at her, with something like pity. You never asked, she said softly. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls had edged closer. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her work apparently forgotten. The pattern was emerging now, not complete, but unmistakable. A past shared unevenly. A secret known by some, guessed by others, and feared most by the man who believed he had outpaced it. Outside, the village carried on with careful normality. Inside Rosewell House, the truth had begun to shift its weight, and someone, Miss Marple knew, was already preparing to make a mistake. The mistake announced itself not with drama, but with haste. It arrived in the form of a sound from the corridor, a hurried footstep checked too late, followed by the unmistakable scrape of a chair being moved where no one had been asked to move it. Inspector Graves turned sharply, his instincts pricked, and for a moment the careful balance of the room tipped toward action. Margaret Dyer was already halfway to the door. I need air, she said, too quickly. This is absurd. I won't sit here being stared at like. I'm afraid you will, Inspector Graves said, his voice calm but immovable. Just for a little while longer. Margaret stopped. Her shoulders rose and fell once sharply. When she turned back, her expression had rearranged itself into something like dignity, but the effort showed. She sat again, this time near the edge of her chair, as though prepared to spring. Miss Marple watched her with quiet concentration. It was not the attempt to leave that interested her. Many people tried to escape pressure, but the timing. Margaret had waited until Clara spoke of recognition, of being known before faces were learned and rearranged. That was when she had moved. Inspector Graves resumed his questioning, but the shape of it had changed. The soft edges were gone. Miss Dyer, he said, you and Mr. Bellamy grew up together. You remained in contact after he left. Margaret nodded stiffly. For a time. And after he returned, we were cordial. Did you argue with him recently? Margaret hesitated, then said we disagreed. About what? About the past, she replied, and for the first time there was no evasion in her voice. He wanted to forget it. I didn't think he had the right. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Forget what? Silence stretched. Clara's breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. The vicar stared at his hands. Miss Marple did not look at Margaret at all. She looked instead at the mirror, which held them all without comment. At Rosewell School, Margaret said finally, there was a girl, long before London, before money. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The pattern settled another fraction into place. She was quiet, Margaret continued. Clever, too trusting. Edmund, her voice faltered, then hardened. Edmund liked to test things. people, he went too far. Inspector Graves did not interrupt. She left the village, Margaret said, in disgrace. Everyone said it was her fault. Edmund let them. He left soon after I stayed. Her mouth twisted. Someone always does. And Clara? The inspector asked gently. Margaret's gaze slid sideways. I didn't know, she said. Not until later. Clara had gone very pale. Her hands had begun again. Rub, check, wipe faster now, as though trying to keep pace with a memory that threatened to outrun her. My mother, Clara said, very quietly, was that girl. No one moved. She never spoke of him by name, Clara continued. But she spoke of the village, of the mirror in the headmistress's office, of being made to stand and look at herself while lies were decided for her. She lifted her eyes to Miss Marple. I recognized the mirror at once. Inspector Graves exhaled slowly. And Mr. Bellamy recognized you? Yes. And the will? He asked. He wanted to make restitution, Clara said. He said money was all he had left to offer. But he was afraid I would speak first. Margaret shook her head. You would have ruined him. No, Clara replied. I would have told the truth. The distinction hung between them. Inspector Graves stood. Then let's be very clear, he said. Did you strike him? Clara looked stricken. No, I swear it. I never touched him. Miss Marple believed her. The truth of Clara's pain lay in its endurance, not its explosion. Inspector Graves turned instead to Margaret. Did you? Margaret's eyes flashed. Of course not. You were in the house, he said. You knew its layout. You had motive. So did she, Margaret snapped, pointing at Clara. So did he. She gestured toward the vicar. We all did, if you insist on digging far enough back. Miss Marple spoke softly. You went into the house after Mr. Bellamy, she said. Margaret froze. That's ridiculous. You left the garden shortly after he did, Miss Marple continued. You were watching the doors, not the people. And when you returned, you stood very still, as though afraid movement might betray you. Inspector Graves's gaze sharpened. Is that true? Margaret laughed a short, brittle sound. So now we're reading minds? No, Miss Marple said. We're reading habits. Yours is restraint. It always has been. Margaret's composure cracked at last. I went in, she said. Yes, to speak to him, to warn him. Warn him of what? The inspector demanded. That Clara would expose him, Margaret said fiercely, that the past wouldn't stay buried. I told him he couldn't buy absolution. And then... Inspector Graves pressed. And then he laughed, Margaret said. Her voice broke. He laughed and turned back to the mirror. As if I were nothing. Miss Marple nodded. That would have been intolerable. Margaret's hands clenched. I didn't mean, she stopped. You struck him, Inspector Graves said. Margaret sagged. I picked up the paperweight. I only meant to shock him, to make him listen. Miss Marple closed her eyes. She could see it clearly now, the angle, the sound, the startled turn. A blow, meant to reprimand, not to kill. He stumbled. Margaret whispered. He grabbed at the mirror. I panicked. I thought he was only dazed. Clara came in. I hid. I didn't know he'd fall like that. Inspector Graves was already signaling to the constables. As they moved, Miss Marple looked once more at the mirror. It reflected Margaret Dyer's face now, stripped of its careful control, showing exactly what had always been there beneath. When the door closed behind her, the room seemed to release a long-held breath. Clara sat very still. Reverend Hale bowed his head. Inspector Graves rubbed a hand over his face. Miss Marple resumed her knitting at last. The needles clicked softly, steadily. The truth had not been dramatic. It never was. It had simply waited for someone to look. After Margaret Dyer was taken away, Rosewell House felt altered, as though a piece of its structure had been removed, and the rest was uncertain how to hold itself upright. The study seemed larger without her sharp presence. The chairs oddly spaced, the silence heavier for having been earned rather than imposed. Clara Fenwick remained seated long after the constables had gone. Her hands lay open in her lap now, no longer rubbing or checking or wiping, as though the habit had finally exhausted itself. The redness along her knuckles had begun to fade, leaving the skin tender but intact. Miss Marple noticed this with quiet satisfaction. Some wounds, she knew, healed only when the truth was spoken aloud. Inspector Graves broke the silence at last. "I'll need a formal statement from you, Miss Fenwick," he said gently. "But for now, you may go home if you wish." Clara looked at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Home?" she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes," he said. "You've done nothing wrong." She nodded slowly, stood, and then hesitated. Her gaze moved to Miss Marple, who met it with calm encouragement. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for listening." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It's a very useful skill," she replied. When Clara had gone, the vicar lingered awkwardly, offering murmured words about prayer and healing that sounded thin even to his own ears. Inspector Graves dismissed him kindly enough, and at last the house was quiet save for the two of them. "You were right," the inspector said, rubbing his temple, "about preparation. Margaret had been holding that anger for years." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It had become part of her. People like that don't explode, they fracture." He glanced toward the mirror. "And Bellamy?" Miss Marple considered. "He was a man who mistook silence for forgiveness," she said, "and distance for absolution." Inspector Graves sighed. If he'd lived another day, the will would have changed. The truth would have come out anyway. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "But timing matters. Fear makes people clumsy." The inspector nodded, then straightened. "There's one thing that still troubles me. Margaret said she hid when Clara entered the room, but no one heard her leave." And yet he frowned. "Someone closed a door. We heard it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, that was Margaret. She went into the corridor and closed the door behind her very carefully. She'd had a lifetime of practice leaving rooms without being noticed." He studied her. "You saw that early on," "I suspected," Miss Marple said. "The habit of restraint again? She was always the sort who made herself smaller to survive." Inspector Graves rose at last. "I'll see you safely home." But Miss Marple shook her head. "Thank you, but I prefer to walk. One thinks better alone." Outside, the village greeted her with cautious normality. Curtains twitched. Lamps glowed. Life resumed its shape, though it no longer sat quite as comfortably as before. Miss Marple walked slowly, her steps measured, her thoughts settled. By morning the news had spread fully. Margaret Dyer's arrest was discussed in hushed voices, often accompanied by expressions of surprise that rang hollow. People preferred villains to come from elsewhere, but when they did not, the village adjusted its stories accordingly. Miss Marple encountered Clara Fenwick again 2 days later, in the same small cafe by the green. Clara looked different, tired, but lighter somehow, as though a weight had shifted. "I'm leaving St. Mildred's," she said, once tea had been poured. "I've been offered a position elsewhere." "That seems wise," Miss Marple said. "Places can hold too much memory." Clara nodded. "I wanted to tell you," Inspector Graves said, "Mr. Bellamy's new will named a charity in my mother's name for girls who need help." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That was a good thing," she said, "though it does not erase the rest." "No," Clara agreed. "But it's something." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Around them, the village resumed its gentle rhythms, cups clinking, voices murmuring, the ordinary machinery of life turning on. When Clara stood to leave, she paused. "Do you think," she asked hesitantly, "that Margaret knew about me?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I think she did. And I think that knowledge frightened her more than she ever admitted." Clara absorbed this, then nodded. "Goodbye, Miss Marple. Goodbye, my dear." Miss Marple watched her go, then finished her tea and rose herself. As she stepped outside, her gaze drifted instinctively toward Rosewell House, visible beyond the trees. The windows were dark now, the mirror inside reflecting nothing at all. She thought of Margaret Dyer, of restraint turned inward until it snapped, of Edmund Bellamy arranging his life like furniture, believing it might hide the past if positioned correctly, of Clara, who had carried a truth quietly until it could no longer remain unspoken. Villages, Miss Marple reflected, were very much like mirrors. They showed you what they wished to see until something struck them hard enough to leave a mark, and once cracked, They never reflected quite the same way again. She turned toward home, her pace unhurried, her mind already settling into familiar patterns. The case was nearly done now. Only the ending remained. And endings, she knew, were often the most revealing part of all. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, as though St. Mildred's were testing each footstep before committing its weight. Officially, the matter was concluded. Margaret Dyer had confessed. The evidence aligned. Inspector Graves returned to his larger jurisdiction, leaving behind a village that assured itself loudly that justice had been done, and life could now proceed as before. Miss Marple knew better. It was not that she doubted the truth of Margaret's guilt. That part was settled, as firmly as such things ever were. What lingered instead was the residue, the subtle imbalance that remained when a long-hidden strain had finally snapped. People carried on, but they did so with a new carefulness, a sense that the ground beneath familiar routines was thinner than they had believed. Rosewell House stood empty now, its gates closed, the garden neglected. The charity bunting had been taken down, but faint impressions remained where it had been tied, pale marks against darker stone. Miss Marple passed the house one afternoon and paused, her eyes lingering on the drawing-room window. Even from outside, she could imagine the mirror's presence, patient and impassive. Inside the village, conversations had shifted. Margaret's name was spoken less often, and when it was, it came wrapped in phrases like "such a shame," and "no one could have guessed." Edmund Bellamy's name fared little better. His generosity was recalled with pointed emphasis, his faults softened by distance and death. Memory, Miss Marple observed, was remarkably accommodating when given sufficient incentive. She encountered Reverend Hale near the churchyard one morning, trimming the hedge with unnecessary vigor. "I keep thinking I ought to have noticed something," he said abruptly, as though the thought had been weighing on him for days. Some sign. Some warning. Miss Marple considered him kindly. "Warnings are rarely helpful once they are recognized," she said. "They tend to announce themselves afterward." He sighed. "Margaret came to me once," he admitted. "Years ago. She spoke of guilt, hers and others. I thought it spiritual distress. I advised patience." "And were you wrong?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "I was incomplete." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "we all are." The vicar watched her go with troubled eyes. That afternoon, a letter arrived for Miss Marple, written in Inspector Graves's precise hand. He thanked her for her assistance, noted that proceedings were moving forward as expected, and added, almost as an afterthought, that one detail continued to trouble him. The paperweight Margaret had used bore her fingerprints, yes, but also faint traces of another's, smudged and partial. The explanation, he wrote, was simple enough. Edmund Bellamy himself had handled it earlier in the day. Nothing remarkable. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. Nothing remarkable, she thought, was rarely accurate. Later that evening, she found herself at the small cafe once more, listening as two women discussed the affair with a faint relish of distance. "Poor Margaret," one said. "She always kept herself to herself." "Yes," the other replied. "You never know what goes on behind closed doors." Miss Marple stirred her tea. Closed doors, she reflected, were often more revealing than open ones. It depended entirely on who had learned how to listen. As she rose to leave, she noticed something new on the notice board near the door. A handwritten card, recently pinned. "Girls' Educational Trust, in memory of Eleanor Fenwick." Miss Marple paused, reading it twice. The solicitor, it seemed, had moved quickly. Money had been set aside, arrangements made. A quiet attempt at repair, enacted too late to save a life, but not too late to matter. Outside, dusk gathered again. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts returning unbidden to the drawing-room, to the angle of the fall, to the sound Clara had described, the dull, heavy thud against wood, and to the mirror which had been struck not by the blow, but by the aftermath of it. She stopped walking. There was something there, something small, almost trivial, that had never quite settled properly in her mind. Margaret had spoken of picking up the paperweight, of striking Edmund Bellamy in a moment of fury, of hiding when Clara entered. But Clara had heard the sound before she turned. Miss Marple resumed. "Walking more slowly now. If Margaret had struck him while Clara was still in the doorway, there would have been shouting, raised voices. Clara had described none. Only sharp words, irritation, dismissal. The blow had come after Clara had turned away, which meant Margaret must already have been close enough to strike, already in the room, already unseen. Miss Marple reached her gate and paused, fingers resting lightly on the latch. Margaret's habit of restraint, her talent for stillness, for occupying space without claiming it. Yes, that worked well enough. But there was something else. The mirror. Margaret had said Edmund laughed and turned back to it, turned his back on her. If so, the blow would have come from behind, clean, unseen. Yet the smear on the mirror frame had been low, drawn downward. A hand reaching not toward an attacker, but toward one last instinctive point of balance, toward something familiar. Miss Marple frowned faintly. She entered her cottage and lit the lamp, the room filling with warm, honest light. Sitting down, she took out her knitting but found she could not begin. The pattern would not settle. Inspector Graves had been satisfied. The village certainly was, and yet Miss Marple knew that satisfaction often arrived too early, mistaking closure for completeness. Margaret had struck Edmund Bellamy, of that there was no doubt, but the moment that followed, the moment of panic, of movement, of fatal imbalance, had not yet been fully understood. And in that narrow space between cause and consequence, Miss Marple suspected, lay the last uncomfortable truth of Rosewell House. She set the knitting aside and reached instead for her coat. There was still time, she thought quietly, to look once more at the mirror. Miss Marple did not hurry. She rarely did, even when her thoughts moved ahead of her steps. The evening air had turned cool, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and cut grass, and the village lay in that suspended moment between supper and sleep when truths had a way of surfacing uninvited. Rosewell House stood silent when she reached it, its windows dark, its presence oddly diminished without the social performance that had once animated it. A single constable remained on duty, more from procedure than necessity, and he greeted Miss Marple with polite surprise. Inspector Graves, it seemed, had anticipated this. She said you might come, the constable admitted, unlocking the door. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped inside. The house felt different at night, not ominous precisely, but expectant. Footsteps echoed more clearly. The air carried memory more easily. She made her way at once to the drawing room. The mirror loomed above the fireplace, catching the faint light from the hallway. In the dimness, it did not reflect so much as absorb. Miss Marple stood before it, not looking at her own image, but at the space around it, the mantel, the floor, the precise angle at which a person would have stood. She moved a chair slightly, then another. She bent with careful effort and examined the base of the fireplace, running her fingers lightly along the polished wood. There, almost invisible unless one knew to look, was a faint indentation, not a crack, not damage, just a shallow mark, consistent with something striking once and being set down again. The paperweight. Margaret Dyer had picked it up. That much was true, but Miss Marple could see now how little force had actually been required. The blow had been sharp, quick, driven not by rage but by years of compressed feelings suddenly released. Enough to stagger, enough to surprise, but not enough to explain what followed. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Edmund Bellamy had turned back to the mirror. That suggested familiarity, even comfort. He had been accustomed to using it not merely to look at himself, but to anchor himself. People did that. They reached for habits when frightened. She stepped into the space where he must have stood and raised one hand instinctively. Her fingers brushed the frame at precisely the place where the smear had been, not the center. The side, low enough to suggest a reach downward rather than outward. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The scene rearranged itself with quiet clarity. Margaret strikes him. He reels not forward but sideways. His balance is already compromised. His head turns. He reaches not for Margaret, not for the air, but for the mirror, for the thing that had so often steadied him. And then something else intervenes. A foot, a chair leg, a body too close to withdraw in time. Miss Marple opened her eyes. Margaret had hidden, yes, but not far, close enough to strike, close enough to panic, close enough to remain unseen when Clara entered. That had required stillness, control. But Margaret had not been alone in that moment. Someone else had been near the door, someone who had not yet entered the room, someone who heard the sound before seeing the fall. Miss Marple's mouth tightened slightly. Clara had spoken the truth. Of that she was certain. But truth could be incomplete without being false. Clara had turned away when Edmund snapped at her. She had heard the sound behind her, had turned back and found him already falling, which meant that when he fell she was still near the threshold. Close enough that a stumbling man might collide with her. Close enough that a misstep, an instinctive attempt to step back, could alter everything. Miss Marple moved to the doorway and stood there, considering the narrow space. She took one careful step back, then another. Her heel brushed the edge of the rug. Yes. Very close indeed, a gentle interruption, not an act of violence. Merely a human reaction, someone stepping aside too late, too awkwardly in shock. A moment's contact, enough to shift a fall into something fatal. Miss Marple returned to the center of the room and stood quietly, allowing the conclusion to settle. Margaret had struck Edmund Bellamy, but Clara Fenwick had been the last human obstacle between him and the floor. The knowledge sat heavily, but without alarm. Miss Marple had learned long ago that responsibility and guilt were not always the same thing. One could contribute to tragedy without intending harm. One could live with that for a very long time. The mirror reflected her now, small and steady, her expression thoughtful rather than severe. "So that's it," she murmured. The constable looked in from the hall. "Did you find something, miss?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but nothing you can arrest." He frowned, uncertain what to make of that. She thanked him again and stepped back out into the night. As she walked home, her thoughts turned not toward justice, which had already taken its course, but toward mercy, which was rarely so efficiently administered. Clara Fenwick would leave the village. She would carry the truth with her, though she might never articulate it fully, not even to herself. Margaret Dyer would live with her own version of events, sharpened by regret and confined by consequence, and the village would choose the story that allowed it to sleep. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, her decision was made. Inspector Graves would not be told, not because he was wrong, but because he was finished. His work required conclusions. Hers did not. She lit the lamp and sat down, her knitting finally settling into rhythm. The needles clicked softly, steadily, as the night deepened outside. The case was in every official sense solved. But Miss Marple knew that the most important truths were not always those that ended matters. Sometimes they were the ones that taught you how carefully people had learned to stand in each other's way. Morning returned to St. Mildred's with deliberate normality. Milk bottles appeared on doorsteps. Curtains were drawn back. The village resumed its habits with the quiet determination of a place that preferred order to introspection. By common, unspoken agreement, the matter of Rosewell House was considered finished. Miss Marple knew how such endings worked. They were rarely about truth. They were about endurance. She sat at her small breakfast table, sunlight spilling across the cloth, and read Inspector Graves's final note. It was brief, procedural and resolute. Margaret Dyer would stand trial. The evidence was sufficient. The case, as far as the law was concerned, required no further reflection. He thanked Miss Marple again for her assistance, a word that failed charmingly to capture the nature of her involvement. She folded the letter and placed it carefully in the drawer beside others like it. There were more than most people would imagine. Outside, the village bell rang the hour. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose, moving with the unhurried assurance of someone whose work was done. She took a short walk, passing familiar cottages, nodding to neighbors who greeted her with a mixture of warmth and caution. People were kind to her now in a slightly different way, respectful, careful, as though she had been quietly reclassified. At the edge of the green she paused and looked once more toward Rosewell House. Workmen had arrived to shutter the windows and tend the grounds. Soon it would be sold, she supposed, and filled again with furniture, laughter, perhaps even happiness. Houses were very forgiving things. They accepted new lives readily, so long as they were not ours to remember. People were less accommodating. Clara Fenwick had already gone. Miss Marple knew this because the cottage she had occupied stood empty, its curtains removed, its door locked with finality. There had been no farewell beyond a short note left at the café, thanking the owner for kindness and apologizing for inconvenience. Clara, Miss Marple thought, had always understood the value of leaving quietly. Margaret Dyer's house, by contrast, remained closed but present. Its garden was tidy to the point of severity, as though restraint itself had been planted and pruned there for years. Miss Marple did not linger. There was nothing more to be learned from that threshold. By afternoon, the village had settled into its chosen narrative. Edmund Bellamy's name was spoken with softened edges, Margaret Dyer's with a puzzled sadness that stopped just short of self-reproach. People shook their heads and said how terrible it all was, how tragic, how unexpected. Miss Marple heard them and understood. Villages survived by smoothing sharp things down until they could be handled without injury. She returned home and took up her knitting by the window. The pattern was a familiar one, learned long ago, requiring attention but not strain. As her needles moved, her thoughts drifted not restlessly, but with the calm precision that came after certainty. Margaret Dyer had struck Edmund Bellamy. That was the truth the law required, and it was true enough. But another truth existed alongside it, quieter and less useful to anyone who needed the world to divide neatly into guilt and innocence. Clara Fenwick had been present at the final moment, not as an aggressor, not as a savior, but as something far more ordinary and therefore more unsettling, a human being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Miss Marple had chosen not to speak of it, not because she feared the consequences, but because she understood them too well. Clara had already lived long years under the weight of her mother's disgrace, under the shadow of a past she had not created. To burden her now with legal culpability for an unintended movement would serve no purpose beyond satisfying an abstract completeness. Justice, Miss Marple believed, was not improved by precision alone. It required proportion. The mirror at Rosewell House would be taken down, perhaps sold, perhaps forgotten. Its role in the affair would be reduced to a curious detail, mentioned occasionally by those who enjoyed embellishment. Mirrors, after all, could not testify. And yet Miss Marple thought they had a way of shaping events without ever speaking. As evening approached, she set her knitting aside and stood by the window. The village lay quiet, bathed in amber light. Somewhere a radio played softly, somewhere else a door closed with the comfortable finality of routine. The case had not ended with revelation, but with acceptance. That, she reflected, was often the true conclusion, not the dramatic unmasking, but the collective decision to live with what had been uncovered. Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a familiar, measured sadness. Human nature, she knew, was endlessly repetitive. People hurt one another not always out of cruelty, but out of fear, pride, and the desperate wish to remain unseen. She turned from the window and tidied her sitting room, restoring each object to its place. Order mattered. It was how one acknowledged disorder without surrendering to it. Before retiring for the night, she paused, her gaze lingering briefly on her own reflection in the hallway mirror. An elderly woman looked back at her, unremarkable, composed, watchful. Miss Marple met her own eyes calmly. "We all stand in someone's way, sooner or later," she said softly. "The trick is to notice it before too much damage is done." The lamp was extinguished. Darkness settled gently. In St. Mildred's life went on, slightly altered but intact, and Miss Jane Marple, as ever, carried the knowledge of what had truly happened with quiet discretion, content that the most dangerous truths were not those that destroyed villages, but those that revealed how easily ordinary people could.